Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me for another one of these videos where we are evaluating the different ways that people interpret the creation account in Genesis, specifically Genesis 1. So there's a playlist there of an overview of the five views of Genesis 1, and I'm trying to give about a 10-minute teaching on each of these views, providing a summary of the view, the strengths of the view, the weaknesses of the view, some popular supporters of that view, some other names of the view, as well as some books that you can look up and read more if you would like to about these views. So I've already reviewed the young Earth creationist viewpoint of Genesis 1. That's the view that I hold. But today, in this video, I want to review old Earth creationism. So let me start by giving a summary of this interpretation of Genesis 1. According to old Earth creationism, life appeared gradually over billions of years, and God miraculously intervened to create Earth's first life. In this view, the 6 days of Genesis 1 are actually 6 long eras. According to old Earth creationism view, Adam and Eve were created 12,000 to 135,000 years ago during the last ice age. In old Earth creationism, they view all humans as descendants of 2 historical persons that were distinct from Neanderthals and Homo erectus. A key part of old Earth creationism is the utilization of what they call constructive integration, which sees scripture and science as complements to each other, not in conflict with each other. They see nature as providing observable, measurable, and verifiable information about God's supernatural handiwork as each successive act prepares for the next. And according to old Earth creationism, when what they call mass speciation, which is kind of the appearance of a sudden group of animals, when mass speciation events appear in science, it is because of divine intervention. Specifically, they believe God introduces diverse species appropriate for Earth's changing conditions. Old Earth creationism believes God's message and meaning is conveyed by the biblical authors through figurative language. According to this view, the universe began in a transcendent event. It unfolds for the benefit of humanity and is sustained continuously according to nature's laws. Thus, the laws of physics have stayed the same, and by that they mean the fall and the flood did not change science as we see it. Old Earth creationism also believes Old Earth creationism does not believe in a literal worldwide flood, and it diminishes the effects of the fall, as I just mentioned. The effects of the fall specifically on the environment that supports life. So that's our summary of old Earth creationism. Now, I don't hold this view, but I still want to share with you some of the strengths that it has to support it. Some strengths of old Earth creationism is that it believes there are 20 major passages in Scripture and hundreds of additional verses that provide commentary on the natural realm, which they believe is scientifically testable. Another support and strength for this view is that the events that occur on day 6 appear to need longer than a day, right? God creates the animals on the land on day 6, and then he also creates Adam and Eve on day 6. So they would look at, Genesis 2, Genesis 29, 30, and 46 as these commentaries about what happened on day 6, the creation of humans and life on the earth, specifically legged animals or creeping things. They would say that has to take longer than a day. Another strong emphasis that this view places, a strength is they place a strong emphasis on Genesis chapter 1 through 11. They place a strong emphasis in Job 37 to 39 that talks about creation, as well as Psalm 104 and Proverbs 8. That would be kind of their 4 main sections of scripture they go to support their view. And that's a strength because they're going to scripture to support their position. Another strength for old earth creationism is that the seventh day continuation, according to Hebrews chapter 4, verses 4 through 11, doesn't necessarily mean that the seventh day of creation was a day. You'd have to go to that passage and read it, but it doesn't really appear that the days of creation are all one day, according to Hebrew 4. It seems to indicate maybe it was a longer period. A strength for this view that people quote, I wouldn't see this as a strength, but this is what they believe, is time according to God is different than time according to us. And they would cite Psalm 94 and 2 Peter 3:8. Another strength is that God's eternality compared to ours is unmeasurable. So that would support that, the earth is old and the universe is old because God has lived eternally. This view also looks at Habakkuk chapter 3:6 and 2 Peter chapter 3:5. Those statements seem to imply from those authors that the earth is very, very old and older than 6,000 or 10,000 years. Another strength, according to this view, is that while the Hebrew word yom is used for literal days when it's used with cardinal and ordinal numbers, this view cites Hosea 6:2 as one example of how the word day is used with a number, but it's not a literal day. Another strength of support is that the Sabbath gets implemented, the Sabbath day of rest isn't always a day in the law, according to Moses. That there is actually years implemented as a Sabbath, according to Exodus 20, verses 10 through 11, and Leviticus 25:4. And a final point of support for the old earth creationist view is they would look at those statements about morning and evening on each of the day of creation account and say that those statements of evening and morning don't make sense on days 1 through 3 because the sun was not created until much later. Okay? So those are the strengths. Here are some weaknesses, in my opinion. Old earth creationism utilizes poetic passages allegedly about creation in Job 38 and 39, Psalm 104, and Proverbs 8. They use those poetic passages to reinterpret the historical narrative description, which is not poetic, in Genesis 1 and 2, right? In Scripture, we want to take the most clear passages and use the clear passages to interpret the less clear ones. We don't want to take the less clear ones and use those to interpret the more clear ones. That's what I was taught to do. And in this view, they seem to take those passages that are talking about creation, but not always directly and clearly, and they use those passages to reinterpret the chapters that are specifically about interpretation. That would be a weakness in my perspective. A second weakness is that if God can create supernaturally and miraculously, then it's possible he could create the earth in just 6 days, right? He could create the universe in just 6 days. If we believe God can raise a man from the dead, he can heal the blind, he can heal the paralyzed, he can do miracles such as that. Why can't he do something so amazing as create everything that we see in just 6 days? Another weakness of old earth creationism is Scripture does not describe creation as a process. It's usually described as an event looking backwards, not as a process that God was working through. A third weakness of old earth creationism is that the Bible describes the flood narrative in Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8 as worldwide, not something that is localized. And according to old earth creationism, the flood was just a local flood in their view. Another weakness is Psalm 90, verse 4 and 2 Peter 3:8. Those verses describe time according to our perspective, right? A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day, or those poetic passages. Those passages are telling us that time doesn't mean the same thing to God as it does to us, but Scripture is given to us to help us understand God, right? So God's going to use time language to communicate to us, right? So a day is still a day according to Scripture, that numbers are still literal and important. We don't just say they're symbolic because time is symbolic to God. God's going to use language we can understand to communicate with us. Another weakness is that they say death did not begin until Adam's sin and humankind's fall in Genesis 3. But in this view, there has to be death before the fall. So that doesn't seem to match either. Another weakness of old earth creationism is that it is forced to reconcile and realign what science teaches with what is in the Scripture, right? And so the old earth creationist, he gets, if you hold this view, you get negative criticism from the young earth view, and you get negative criticism from the scientific view, because you're having to take science and then use Scripture and integrate them, and you're having to make concessions on both sides according to Scripture and science. Another weakness, similar to what I already shared, is that the old earth creationist view requires a new reading of Genesis and a new interpretation of Genesis that did not occur until the 1800s. It really wasn't until the early 1800s that people started to consider the earth is older than what Scripture teaches. So this is a new view, and I'm not always one to jettison 1800 years of Christian history and Christian interpretation for something that's so new and fresh. Another weakness is that it requires, old earth creationism requires a reinterpretation of Genesis 1 as scientific beliefs change over time. Now, what do I mean by that? If you go into any secular college now and you say, I believe what Darwin believed, they would laugh at you. No one believes what Darwin believed. They believe in some of his basic theories or places, a few things he said, but science is changing. And if science is changing over time, and old earth creationism tries to reconcile Christian teaching with science, then we're having to change our Christian teaching based on what science is doing, okay? Another weakness, I have a lot for this view. I don't take this view. I tried to give their strengths, but I'm sharing what I believe are weaknesses. Sometimes it appears when I read old earth creationist writers, they're saying more than what the text is saying. You know, when I read Job chapter 37, 38, and 39, or Psalms 104, or Proverbs 8, the old earth creationism, they're reading a lot into those passages that I don't think was intentionally meant by those authors, to be honest. So that's a weakness. Another weakness, this is a scientific weakness. Most DNA and genetic theory that we know now does not believe humanity descended from one couple, right? You know, that number used to be, they believed there was about 10,000 humans, and now it's maybe closer to 1,000. But the old earth creationist view doesn't match what even science teaches according to genetic theory and DNA science. Another weakness, in my opinion, is that the old earth creationist view places too much emphasis on general revelation. General revelation is the things we see in nature. It places more emphasis on general revelation than it does on special revelation, which is what we have in Scripture, something specifically given to us. Generally is out there that we see. Scripture is given to us in words that we can read and interpret. And I think they put too much emphasis on the general revelation that we see. Another weakness of the old earth creationist view is that according to science, birds appeared hundreds of millions of years after land animals. That's what science teaches, that animals were on the land and then animals began to fly in the earth, fly in the sky. But according to Scripture, birds were created on day 5 before land animals on day 6. So the old Earth creationist view doesn't match what science even teaches. Another weakness is, according to science, fruit-bearing plants, which were created on day 3 of Genesis 1, appeared hundreds of millions of years after sea creatures created on day 5. Again, what scripture teaches is backwards according to science. So the old Earth creationist view is trying to reconcile science with scripture, but there are super strong contrasts, and that leads them to having to either compromise what scripture says or say that they disagree with science, the very thing they're trying to reconcile. And a weakness that I have under many of these views, the Hebrew word for yom is used literally when it's used with ordinal numbers, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or cardinal numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. When it's used with ordinal and cardinal numbers in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word yom refers to a 24-hour period when it's used with numbers in that way. So those are the strengths and weaknesses of that view. Other names of old Earth creationism, it sometimes is called progressive creationism. I'm adapting some of what I've shared with you from author Hugh Ross, who is very widely known. And he wrote a chapter in the book, 4 Views on Creation, Evolution, and Intelligent Design. And I've adapted some of his material for this video. Some other things you could read if you're curious to learn more about old Earth creationism. You can look at Alan Hayward's book, Creation and Evolution. You can look at Hugh Ross's book titled A Matter of Days. You can read B. Rom, which has a book titled The Christian View of Science and Scripture. Or you can read Fazail Reyna and Hugh Ross. They have a book titled Origins of Life, Biblical and Evolutionary Models Face Off. And a popular supporter of this, in addition to those people, obviously, that have books published, would be Ray Stedman. He takes the old Earth progressive creationist viewpoint. So I know this video is a little longer than some of the others, but I want to do justice to each view to give a summary of it, give their strengths that they hold for it, but also I'm going to interpret it and give some weaknesses as a young Earth creationist reading these things. So I hope this view was helpful. There are a lot of different kind of views within the view, if that makes sense. The progressive creationism or old Earth progressive creationism is kind of the title, but then there's sometimes different sects even within that. So I would welcome your comments, what you think about this view. Do you hold this view and why? Do you disagree with this view and why? You're welcome to share them in the comments there. I hope this video is helpful for you. And I'll put a link down there in the description to my notes that I'm using for this, so you can read word for word what I'm sharing and interact there too. Thanks again for watching. Hope to catch you again in another video.